I'm John Callis from Masters Cast. I'll be your moderator. Thank you. This is the Mike Young He-Man cartoon panel, and if we could go down the line, if everyone would please introduce themselves and let us know what was your role on the cartoon.
Hi, my name is Michael Halpern. I was brought in by Mattel to develop the new television series. They brought me back after 20 years. I guess they dug up my grave and thought that I could do a job on this. And it was an opportunity to recreate the series the way I thought it should be done.
I'm Gary Hartle. I'm a producer, director, and sometimes storyboard artist on the new series. And my challenge was to bring all their ideas onto the screen.
My name is Ian Richter, and I was the executive at Mattel that was part of the team that was bringing the new series and the property back to life in 2002.
My name is Dean Steffen. I was the writer, I guess head writer, story editor. More importantly, I was the Four Horsemen based the body, sculpting up He-Man on my torso.
I thought that was me.
So I guess the obvious place to start is, how exactly did the development start on the new cartoon series?
Well, okay, I guess that's me. Yeah, the 20th anniversary of He-Man was approaching. I had created the show, as most of you know, back in 1982 when the first show went on the air. I created the original version, wrote the original Bible for the show, and worked on the show as a creative consultant for the first season that it was on. After that, it sort of went out of my hands and went into the hands of Filmation. 20 years later, I received a call from Mattel out of the blue, and they said, "Would you be interested in coming back? You're involved in that, coming back on." And we saw. I guess you saw the original Bible.
Yeah, we had come across Michael's Bible, and at the time, the 20th anniversary of the toy line, Mattel really wanted to bring He-Man back. And in the entertainment division, we were really getting up to speed on, I had grown up with He-Man as a kid and I had been a big fan. And so it was a lot of fun to really start to, with Rob Hudnut and the marketing team and everybody involved at Mattel, really start to dive into the property and the lore and the history. And through that process, we came across Michael's Bible. And going through it, it was so much about it was really the perfect foundation to approach how to relaunch the property. So we thought that, well, what's the best thing to do? Well, let's just call Michael and let's get him in here and involve him from the beginning, because so much of what he had originally mapped out in 1982 was just as good in 2000 when we were doing this as it was back when he wrote it.
Yeah, that's right. And so we had a lot of meetings. Ian, the whole group of us at Mattel would sit around for a couple of hours, bat ideas around which way to go, kind of direction. And then they said, well, why don't you just come back with something that you think is going to work? So I went back to my original notion and I expanded on it somewhat and came up with with some new ideas, but basically trying to deal with the story as it would be 20 years later, expressing some of the ideas that are going on in the world today, not as quite as naive as it was back in 1982, with a little more flair, with a little more edge to it. Plus, as I said in the previous panel, what I wanted to do was, hopefully, that the animators, and they did do this, by the way, Mike Young did a fabulous job, and that is to create the characters that express the way they were originally written. So whereas He-Man is He-Man, He-Man is actually the alter ego of a young kid, a teenager, an 18-year-old kid. And if he's going to be an 18-year-old kid, he should look like an 18-year-old kid before he says, I have the power, and boom, he becomes Mr. Muscle. And that's exactly what they did, and I think it worked much better. Now, there are people who go back to the original series and say, oh, yeah, but you played around with that classic series. Well, the original idea in the classic series was to do just that. But because of economic restraints, they didn't do it. There were other things that I wanted to do, and that is to get the origins story into the series, which they did very cleverly. We did the first 3 episodes, or 2 episodes, the first 3. The first 3 episodes are the origin episodes, which did exactly that. It showed how Adam becomes He-Man, the development of it, the development of the characters, gives you more backstory so that you understand the characters better. And that was sort of the direction we went. They also asked me to do, later after I developed this, Mattel asked me if I would come up with some storylines, and I came up with 25 storylines for the first season, hopefully, none of which Mike used. I think they're great. I even have them here.
Awesome.
But one of the problems with it was the idea that I had, which we had discussed at Mattel within the boundaries of the Mattel thing, was to do a series which had a continuing storyline, as well as a B story that would be finished, would begin and end with each episode. The problem with that, as a series, there's a problem with doing a continuing storyline when you get into syndication, I assume. It used to be that way. Whereas it's still that. You have a problem because suppose they put in episode number 9 ahead of episode number 3, then your continuing story sort of like falls flat. It's not as if you're doing a network show. But that was the original idea, was to do a continuing storyline. At the end, my version had at the end of season 1, He-Man actually becomes a renegade. Skeletor is sort of infiltrates into the Eternian society, convinces people that he's changed his ways, becomes what they think is a good guy, but in reality, he puts Randor out of business by almost killing him, places Marlena into a suspended animation, and takes over as dictator of Eternia, and convinces the people in Eternia that He-Man is a renegade and a bad guy. So he and the Masters of the Universe have to leave, and they have to go into this bunker. Sort of, I call it the Cave of Freedom. Why not? And they fight their battle from there. It's sort of a Robin Hood story, essentially. You know, he's Robin Hood, and Skeletor is King John. That never worked. Guys?
You did mention a lot of changes though that were made. Perhaps we could explain the decision process behind, say, Cringer not talking,
right.
Queen Marlena not being from Earth.
Right. Yeah. The other thing, I think you guys did that as an episode of Marlena flying through space as an astronaut. No, you never did that. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought it was part of it.
That was back in the filmation.
That was back in the old days. Okay.
Yeah.
That was back in the old days. But just to go into that opening sequence, I mentioned this in the panel at 1 o'clock, that originally give me your sword. I have a better one at home. I have one that actually talks. When He-Man does, I have the power, and you get all that lightning and stuff, and it hits Cringer, and Cringer goes, "Arrgh!" Right? And he turns into the Battle Cat. He turns into the Battle Cat. Well, originally, Filmation decided that wasn't the way it was going to be, that when the lightning hit Cringer and he turns into the Battle Cat says, I have the power too. And I said to, you weren't here, you're too young to be there, but the original guys who were at Mattel, I said, Battle Cat and Cringer don't talk. They're animals. They should not talk. They should use their physicality to tell people what's going on, so that there's a sort of a better tension. And Mattel agreed with me, and we went back to Filmation and said, take out the dialogue. Now, if you watch the opening sequence on the original show, and when Battle Cat goes, roar, you'll watch his lips. He says, roar, but what he's saying is, I have the power too. He's saying it, so if you watch it that way. The other thing was about the origins of Marlena, Queen Marlena. Queen Marlena actually starts out as an astronaut on Earth. She's flying, she's the captain of a space shuttle. Her cohorts on the space shuttle are 3 people. One is Evelyn Powers. Another one is Dr. I can't remember his name now. And the other one, what?
You heard somebody out there?
What did he say? Dr. who?
D.E. Scope.
D.E. Scope, thank you. See, you remember better than I do. D.E. Scope, and the other one is the guy who's the mechanic, who does all the repairs on the thing, and his name is too obvious, Biff Beastman. And what happens is when He-Man breaks through the mystic wall, when he first attacks Eternia, that puts a rip in the fabric of time. You can deal with that any way you want. And as the spaceship that Marlena is captaining is flying, it goes through space, it hits that rip in the fabric of time, and she finds herself in the Eternian universe. The ship goes out of control and crashes in Eternia, and when she wakes up in the ship, she's wearing a spaceship and all that, she's alone. The other 3 are not there. King Randor comes and rescues her. Meanwhile, the other 3 have ended up on the dark side of Eternia, and because of the radioactivity and all that that's going on, that's what creates Skeletor, by the way. It was the great wars that took place on the dark side. So all the radioactivity, all sorts of things going on there. That's why Skeletor becomes Skeletor. But the radioactivity impacts those 3, Evelyn, Powers, and Biff Beastman, and they turn into Evelyn, Triclops, and Beastman. And they realize they hate Marlena because she's the captain, and they all feel that they should have been captain of the space shuttle. And when they meet Skeletor, who wants to use them for his devices, they realize that they can use her for their devices and get even with Marlena and attack her and maybe just kill her eventually. Meanwhile, Skeletor realizes that he can use them to do his own bidding to capture Castle Grayskull. Meanwhile, Randor falls in love with Marlena, they have a child, he turns out to be Prince Adam, and the rest is history. That's how the opening was supposed to be.
And maybe Ian can explain why Mattel didn't go with that direction the second time around.
So one of the things that we did is we were getting up to speed on all of the great mythology and all the great stories and all the great work that had been done on the property previous, is we tried to look at it all through a sort of the filter of what are the aspects of the original property that we could retain and also weave together into a coherent mythology. And I think that with Dean and Michael and Gary and the team at Mattel, it was really a question of what is worth keeping and what is worth moving away from. And there were a lot of things we knew would be controversial. And John, to your question about Cringer and talking, we debated that. We felt that is there a way to create the version of He-Man that we remembered, but not necessarily the version of He-Man that if you were to go back and watch the episodes, you would find. And I think that, again, it was very controversial, but we tried to take we were inspired by the Four Horsemen's designs, and they did an incredible job. I think we can all agree that, let's just give it up for the Four Horsemen. I would say probably more so than any other factor, those designs were so inspirational to the whole team, and we really wanted to be faithful to that tone. And what was the promise of those incredible designs? And I think it was so through that filter that we went back and looked at all the old episodes, went back and looked through Michael's fabulous Bible, and then asked ourselves, how do we weave this all together in something that's coherent? And in doing that analysis, the question of whether or not Cringer would talk, it felt as though that would make the show younger than the promise of the Four Horsemen's designs.
One of the other things we had, I remember these early conversations that we had talked about, and there was an episode in the old days where Skeletor actually draws everybody from other planets and brings them to his planet, and that's kind of why they are what they were. But we began to look at Earth. I think we were looking at all these beautiful vistas and shots, and you know, like when you look at Star Wars, they have like a ice planet, a desert planet. I go, we have all that on this one planet. You know? So why not make it that these were races, which then gave Randor something to do, pulling the races together, and so it made it a bigger picture, because we're going to explore a planet that we've never seen before, but it made more sense that that these characters all lived here and all had a, you know, they wanted their piece of the pie of what was going on in Eternia.
Yeah, and this is great. I'm glad that you have this. This was a map that very early on, I created this in Photoshop based on Michael Halpern's original Bible, so that we could just, as we started to brainstorm with Dean and with Gary, what's the sandbox that we get to play in? Let's really invest in Eternia. Let's make Eternia the realm of where this show takes place. And so it was really, in many ways, inspired by what was in that great Bible and just really investing in that. And as Gary said, we have all those incredible places on our planet, so why not have all that stuff on Eternia?
Well, now that you've invested so much now in Eternia, you went and created a lot of new characters, just like Filmation did during their series run. So how did you go about developing new characters, making them work into the storyline?
Well, I think there are two, there's sort of the two frameworks. You know, there's the framework that was necessary from a consumer products point of view. You know, what are the goals of Mattel in terms of rolling out new characters and bringing back great original characters. And then there was just the needs of the story. And oftentimes we found that many more characters were necessary for the story than what was necessary for the strategy of rolling out additional toys.
Right.
And turn it over to Dean to talk about some of those new characters.
Yeah, I think, to me, I was not all that, I didn't have that much, I didn't grow up with He-Man, it wasn't my thing, so I was coming to it fresh, and a lot of these characters apparently, in the old show, they weren't that developed, or they were made as toys, you know, something like Stinkor or Count Marzo or whatever like that. And even some of the main characters like Too Bad and guys like that weren't that developed. And I think what my question, because I was so new to it, it's like by asking who are these guys, you know, and they say, well, we never really knew because we never did it, you know, so we just sort of put them in the background. So I think maybe what I brought to the table a lot is to stress that if we don't know who a character is, why don't we base a story around him and find out, you know, and test him and, you know, put him through the crucible, as Aristotle would say, and, you know, find out what he's made of. And as a writer, that makes you confront, you know, what makes a character tick, and when you do that, then you find out what their foibles are, what they might be scared of, what they might be vulnerable to, and I think we tried to do that. As a matter of fact, a good example is Too Bad, because we actually, in the beginning, the, you know, three-parter, we actually had him as an existing character already, and then once we're about 5-6 episodes in, we backtracked, we said, let's do an origin of Too Bad. How does he become this? And then we came up with the bounty hunter story, and eventually at the end, Skeller fused them into one guy as a thing. So in that case, we actually went back to the original designs and storyboards of the three-parter, and, you know, lifted him out so that we could exploit him later as a character. And, you know, that what I always say is we had an embarrassment of riches. I mean, we could cherry pick from the original series as much as we wanted to, but we had the luxury of knowing we're going to build a chronology. When they started the first series, they didn't know it's going for 130 episodes or whatever. We didn't know either, but we did know that we could start with a chronology, a geography, you know, something that they thought of in episode 30. We already know this is part of the He-Man world, so we could put in the Diamond Ray of Disappearance just as a fun thing. We could put in Count Marzo, and we could reference things like that. And I'll just say one more thing about my take on Marlena. Even though it wasn't my decision that she wasn't from Earth, you know, I, as a newcomer to this world, I didn't see any reason. Imagine Star Wars, you know, they're often this thing, and then you got a guy from Earth. Like, when is he from? The cowboy days, you know, 12,000 years. To me, Earth did not exist in this universe, and to put a character that would sort of tie it into a time or place in Earth to me, it didn't. I didn't see the point of it, you know, just coming at it fresh like that.
Yeah.
One of the things we did with Marlena too, is we left that kind of open-ended. We knew we wanted to do something with that. There's the one point where the lizard guys are attacking her.
Snake-man.
Snake-man.
Yeah, that's right. It was the snake-man. I'm sorry, the snake-man. Geez, wow. But the snake-man attack her, and you find out that all of a sudden she's able to, you know, handle herself. She kicks some ass, you know, and you said to her, whoa, because it began to add questions to it. We would do that. We would take an episode, and there'd be a little slice, because we were rewatching some of this stuff, and what was interesting about it was some of the B stories were sometimes the more interesting story, because they would keep opening up little boxes, little Pandora boxes everywhere that we could go back and explore. But we knew that these were directions that we wanted to take. We didn't have all the time that we wanted to go through all the things, but we were opening.
And we had, I mean, some of our favorite characters were Tila and Evelyn, you know, good guy and a bad, you know, I think we really did the women characters well. And Marlena, we always felt we made her a little passive, you know, she's not from Earth, so she doesn't have that rich backstory. So we finally did in, I don't know if it was Council of Evil, where she, Man-at-Arms wants to retire and Randor's, and she said, you two sound like a couple of whining infants, you know, this and that, you know. So she kind of asserts herself as the sort of, you know, the Shakespearean wife, and then in the battle scene with Snake Man, we see her that she can kick ass. So we know she's got some mad skills, but she's just kind of keeping them tucked down because that's her place, maybe in the hierarchy. But I think farther down the line, we might have shown her sort of taking over and some.
Yeah, to follow up on that, in the original idea was that Marlena was going to be tougher, and Filmation certainly made her. And my goal was to have both Tila and Marlena being really tough ladies, and being able to control. As a matter of fact, there was an episode, I think it was the episode I wrote of Machines and Men, where she's actually the emissary.
Yeah, that's
Remember,
the one.
it opens up the end. That's what this
That's
thing's
the
like.
one.
Right.
That's the one.
I wrote of Machines and Men, where she's the emissary. She's the ambassador who has to deal with one of the other races on the planet, and her ship crashes because of a loss of power, and then He-Man has to take control and regain the power from this weird little dude who lives in this strange cave place. But that was my goal all along, and it was hard in the initial series to get that across. They got it across with Tila, certainly, in the original, because she was this liberated young woman who was always kicking ass with Prince Adam and always besting him at whatever he did. And even later in your series, she always did too. When they were fighting, they have these things where they stand on those discs, remember? And they're battling each other. Well, that also is a nice in this episode I wrote. Okay. And the power goes out, but she's beating the hell out of him. And that was the initial goal, and the whole idea was to do that. I was glad that Mike Youngs and Ian and all you guys decided to go with it, because I felt that was very strong, especially in the 2000s.
Right. The women characters, I think they're interesting because Evelyn is the most duplicitous among Skeletor. She's
Absolutely.
probably the smartest one also, and she ever-shifting alliances. And Tila's interesting because she's got this mysterious sort of backstory, which we sort of allude to the fact that she's a sorceress's daughter, and we don't quite spell out if she's either Man-at-Arms' daughter, possibly, maybe even Fisto's daughter. If you remember out of the past that we went back and forth. We had a lot of discussions about that, and you know, so she's got that sort of sorcerer's blood running through her, and out of the past, I think she sort of has a deja vu, a sort of a sense memory of things her mother went through, and they mistake her for her mother when her mother came down out of the castle to be among the mortals and got impregnated, and it's
because eventually we wanted her to become the new sorceress.
Right, that was the idea behind. I have that in the Bible. Yeah. One of the interesting things about Tila and the sorceress is that Tila has this almost a dual personality. She doesn't know when she gets a psychic something. She can see something in her mind. It scares the hell out of her, and she doesn't know why it's happening. And it takes a few episodes. I don't know if you ever did in the show, but eventually she discovers why she has it, and that also scares her because she's not sure she wants the power.
it's very low in existence being the sorcerer. You're stuck in
It's
the
like the
castle, you know, you're sitting with the crystals. And even in Power of Grayskull, we tried to show the precursor to that there was a previous sorceress. There's a previous version of He-Man, I guess. You know, we got into, I know it's a controversial, I know it's John's favorite. You know, because just as somebody like me who comes to it by the power of Grayskull, I mean, what does that mean?
Yeah.
You know, as it turns out, I ran into the guy who named the toys, and it turned out his sister-in-law's last name was Gray, and he needed to come up with a name, so he called the castle Grayskull. I mean, that's the way sometimes things happen. But in the series, in the mythology, the canon, or whatever word you want to use, by the power of Grayskull, what does it mean? Is it the castle? And you know, so then we thought, if it was the castle, was it named after the original owner, and who was this guy? And you know, then we came up with King Grayskull, and Gary and Ian had a lot of thoughts about what it means to take up the mantle of He-Man and to be King Grayskull. Before that, it's sort of an innocence, someone who's never spilled blood. I think we had talked about that, we never spelt that out. It's somebody who's sort of pure of heart and integrity, and that would be sort of what Adam took up when he became, you know, when he got the power and inherited. When evil rose again, there was a need for a new hero, and backtracking, we saw that power originally lay with King Grayskull, and the sword and the...
That really wasn't quite what I had in mind. I don't know, if you read the Bible, you sort of get the idea that what happened was when the elders of Eternia, who were living, who basically held court in the Hall of Wisdom, were going to be attacked by Grayskull. What they did was they converted the Hall of Wisdom into Grayskull to scare people away, and they themselves were melded into this crystal, which is held within Grayskull. And the power of Grayskull literally meant, to me, obviously not to anybody else, meant to me that the power of Grayskull was the power of all the wisdom of the universe. That's
I like that. That's better than what we had. I really do.
I think when we were all discussing the episode Power of Grayskull, I mean, we were discussing a lot of these very things, and I think it felt like to us that the decision to be selfless is a very powerful decision to make.
Yes.
And I think for us, it's that selflessness, that sacrifice that King Grayskull makes in that episode that really is, I think, again, for those of us at the time and in that episode, that was how we defined what is the power of Grayskull. It's the power that can be achieved through being selfless.
And Power of Grayskull was a big episode that had Hordak in it. There were a lot of season 3 rumors that Hordak was going to return. Marlena might have been revealed to be half Gar or Gar. Was She-Ra going to fit into the picture somehow? Could you maybe elaborate on any plans that you did have for season 3?
I mean, I think, you know, a lot of that stuff, I think as Dean was saying earlier, we were always trying to plant seeds throughout the show. Plant story seeds and ideas that could be organically reintroduced later. Whether it's the fact that Hordak might come back for another season, or that the Snake Men might have you know, more to do, and we just sort of wanted to really make it feel as though there is a much bigger story for this entire world than what we're seeing in any particular episode or any particular season. And so I think that, you know, in many ways, a lot of where we were thinking of going, and again, it was all speculative because, you know, we never really wrote any episodes beyond episode 40, which I think is out there. And I think the guys at MV Creations did it in Val. The guys did an incredible comic book based on that.
I got episode 40 right here.
Yes.
I'll be selling it for $20. Never produced.
But I think, you know, John, to your question, I think that amongst the things that we had discussed, and again, it's all speculative, but it was that that Hordak would take over. We actually talked about making having an episode where Clawful actually became really intelligent through magic, and that he became so smart that he was a threat to Skeletor, Evil Lyn, all these characters. But actually, in that moment when he became intelligent, he gave Skeletor the idea to use Faker to frame He-Man that then led to Skeletor being able to take over and cast He-Man out. And we did in episode 2, The Courage of Adam, it's a very quick frame that goes by, but we flickered an image. Remember those training androids that Man-at-Arms made? We did like a couple frame flicker of the Faker colors as a plan, knowing that when Clawful inspired Skeletor, he would then go and find one of those androids and use that android to frame He-Man in the eyes of all of Eternia. And that idea would have come from Clawful. But then as soon as he got that idea, recognizing the threat that this intelligent member of his horde would be, quickly reversed the spell and put Clawful back to where he was.
And we also, throughout the first 2 seasons, we put the Hordak relationship with Keldor, sort of the deal with the devil, where basically he saved him after the beginning. You know, a few episodes later, we show how after he got burned, he sort of made a deal with Hordak to sort of save his life, and Hordak was going to make, he wanted payment on that debt, and we sort of alluded to that in a later episode, Price of Steve, one of those down the line. And basically, it was a deal with the devil that he made, and Hordak was going to come back and kick Skeletor's ass. In the meantime, the Snake Men sort of took on a life of their own, and we sort of played that out. The Snake Men threat was pretty much going to be put to an end in episode 40, available at the signing. But Hordak would have been probably our main villain in conflict with Skeletor, who was sort of probably below him on the power scale. At the same time, we were talking about all the things that Michael was talking about, having Keldor take over and Skeletor being revealed as Randor's brother, and also finding out that he actually has a rightful grievance. He actually does. He may be the older brother. He may have a rightful grievance to the throne, but because he was kind of a dick or a jerk,
official attorney.
He went bad. So the good guy became King Randor. But it's always interesting when a villain has a beef that's really, you can understand. And he even says in, I think it was The Last Stand, where Adam is up against Skeletor and he takes his staff, and Skeletor says, taking what doesn't belong to you, like father, like son, I suppose. Right. So he felt like he was the rightful heir, even though he was nuts and psychotic and everything. Maybe Keldor, maybe Randor drove him to that in some way by being the good brother or whatever. But also the Renegades, and then we had talked about that, and then possibly, it doesn't really matter what could possibly happen, but we were going to send Randor to hell, basically, to Despondos, which you saw in the Power of Grayskull, which is a zone where you kind of like a phantom zone, or it's just hell. And basically, He-Man would go down there eventually to look for him. Almost like Professor X in X-Men. At one point, he got sent to
the Savage Land.
Yeah, the Savage Land. It's sort of an element of that.
It's like
and also
Orpheus.
Yeah, and He-Man would also be trying to redeem himself, because if we use that thread of he got framed, then we were going to have a frame that he killed his father, basically, and until he could bring him back and show everybody, hey, Dad's alive. He-Man is an outlaw and stuff. So we had all these threads going, and we had there was a real richness. We could have brought back the Snake Men anytime. We could have made Tila the Sorceress. We could have killed off people. And if you'll notice, in a lot of the episodes, we introduce a race or a character like out of the past. We refer to the Great Unrest and stuff, and we're giving ourselves the luxury to cherry pick with that stuff and make find the chronology. The Snake Men were then, and the Hordak and Power Grayskull. We showed that those two forces were historically in conflict also.
What was really cool was these guys would come in the room, and I'm like the visual side, so they would start spinning a few of those yarns. And it would become real exciting for myself and for Jay, because when you have backstory like that He-Man and Skeletor are brothers, because I'm trying to figure out how to lay out the first fight, because you could just bring in all the masters, and sometimes a fight scene can actually be boring if you're just kind of, okay, now I've got to be on all these guys and go through all this. As soon as they said that, I knew where it had to be. it had to be between Randor and Skeletor. That's where the story was. There's always a pre-life story before you get to, when the cameras roll and you see the story that's going on. That's why every time for myself personally, there was a point where Skeletor was trying to break in and going underneath into Castle Grayskull, and there's that great scene that Tim did where you pan out and Randor is right behind him. Every time Randor showed up, when it was Randor, there was an electricity in the air. Why? Because there was all this history, prehistory, that you could feel. You may not have known all the things, but you could feel it. And so when Randor is there and Keldor comes in, and he's this handsome man, and we had started bouncing the name Gar around because of it, the island of Almargar. But we're just trying to find names production-wise because everybody else race had a name, and we just said that's what we kind of coined them.
Yeah.
But anyway, so as he comes in and he's this handsome Gar, Roman Gar looking, and all of a sudden you see him fighting, and the Gar are stronger, and leap higher and do all these things. But then when he goes to throw the acid, and all of a sudden the acid comes back in his face, and you see Randor, even though he's not as strong, has this signature move, which we played in later. We started running that through, that he does this signature move, and when He-Man does it, Randor goes, just little hints moving toward where we're going in the future. And that's what's always wonderful when you're a person that has to do the visual image. Because you can tell me, go ahead and just blow something up, or go ahead and these guys sword fight or whatever. But if you tell me what the risk is, underlying risk is, if you tell me what the underlying story is, well, you can see that the Masters, which we're going to show them later, but in this fight they moved away. The story was between the two of them sword fighting and what was going on between them. You had to establish that so that every time they showed up or a line was played like that, like you stole something from me, and just like your father and all that type of stuff. You're laying, you've got to lay it both ways. You got to lay the road, both directions.
You got to realize in animation, the board guys and the directors are the equivalent of actors in live action. Like when Meryl Streep gets a script and she's in a fight, I don't know how many fight scenes she's in, but she wants to know who is this character, where did she grow up, and stuff like that. And what Gary's talking about is what an actor brings to. I mean, the voice actor just gets lines and they read it, and we tell them basically you're angry, you're getting hit against the wall. They are not that involved in that part of it. But the board guys and the directors really are. They are acting out the script. And if they know who their character is, if they can make a move so it echoes a brother or a different race, it's bringing it to life, it gives it richness, and that comes back to the writers. And then we say, oh yeah, we can really play.
They're iterative, they inform each other.
Right, absolutely. And these are the kind of discussions we had. I mean, Ian and Gary and I, not as often because we were in different locations, but it was sort of like we would get excited about the richness of this world. And even if we didn't use things, we might use a little bit of it and say we can tease this out. And I think that's how the Visto came about in Out of the Past. And,
Ian was our adrenaline, because these guys would be talking, they get this stuff down in stories, and then he'd come in. And Jay and I were in the same room. We actually had a table.
Jay
Oliva, working on Batman and a lot of things right now. And but we'd be in the same room, and we'd be talking back and forth, and Ian kind of would be like a little tornado, get us all this stuff, and boom, go back out again. And he didn't realize what we'd be in there going, wah, like this, and then attack the boards. And we were complimented by some of you that some of the early boards were even inked, and these must just be promotional boards. Those were the boards. We were so into it that we were just delving into them like we were making comic books. And sometimes they were rougher, but when we could, we really would play.
It was fantastic going down to Mike Young's and seeing what these guys had on the wall and what they were working on. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, it was incredible. I would say there's one other thing that I think is really interesting that I don't think a lot of people know. Around the time that we were doing the show, this is between 2000 and 2002, the internet was still kind of young, right? And we're still coming together. But what was so interesting is that the fan boards and the incredible database that Bustatoons and I think Zadok and the whole team that put together that original He-Man review site back that was like an invaluable tool for us when we were going back, because we couldn't really practically watch all of those original He-Man episodes, but we could go to that website, and it was incredibly valuable. Having the message boards, even before we started development, was really, really interesting, and it was kind of a new thing. And the idea to make Skeletor Keldor was directly from the boards. So when I discovered that that was something that was He-Man lore, I thought, what if we actually made that come true? And so the message boards and the fan community had a huge influence on this show. When we were looking for other villains, because we just needed some for the story, I knew that one of the message board posters, his name was Cal Marzo. And so it was because of that that I went back into some of the old series with the guys, and we looked up that old character, and you know, quite frankly, we didn't know if that was really the right character to reinvent, but we thought, you know what, let's do it. Let's make Cal Marzo the coolest, most badass character that we can, and pay tribute to that fan who likes that character so much that he's called himself that on the message board. So I think it's important to know that the fan community for this property had an incredible influence on all of us making the show, and it was a real privilege for us to be part of the property, and I think it's just something that, you know, just you guys should feel really good about, that it's really the fan base was so important to us, and we would all read the fan boards as the episodes aired. And
on He-Man.org.
Yeah, so you know, I think we should just take a second and give a round of applause to He-Man.
Well, speaking of fans, we are almost basically out of time, but let's have a chance for one fan question. Go ahead.
Okay, so He-Man Adam is essentially the descendant of King Grayskull, who was married to the sorceress.
No. He-Man Adam's the descendant of Marlena and Randor. Oh, I mean, he's the son of Randor. I mean,
he's a descendant of King Grayskull, who was at the time married to the woman who became the sorceress, and the sorceress, her biological daughter is Teela. So wouldn't it be somewhat incestuous inbreeding if Teela and He-Man got married and had a kid named Hero?
Teela was never going to get together.
Okay.
I can't
I had nothing at all to do with that scenario.
But you kind of ship for those characters. Wouldn't that technically be
It's
like
not necessarily that Teela or the sorcerers were related to King Grayskull. There was a bond there, you know, whether it's, you know, through the DNA or through, you know, morality and stuff. And I should also mention on Eternia, you know, the sexual activity is not the same as it is here on Earth. The genitals are completely different.
If you think it will happen.
I think that was the thing, and that we were laying that each of these that had to take up the mantle, whether it was the sword or whether it was becoming sorcerers, there was a lot you were giving up, you know, because you were being other-centric. You were worrying more about the people of Eternia than your own personal things that you were going to get. And so I think that was the thing that was interesting about that. And also, one of the kind of, like I said, pre-life stories to those type of things was that all the kings from there until Adam had fought in those wars, trying to bring together Eternia and spilled blood, and that Adam had not, and that he was in a place in his heart and his mind that was ready for the sword. So, I mean, that's the direction we were going with that. But no, it wasn't going to go there.
Let me just say that I like what they did with Randor and Keldor and that whole thing. However, having said that, my idea was that Eternia really never had a king. It was ruled by the elders, who were like, you know, who were these sages, these wise people, and only when they had to coalesce and become this crystal, and Eternia lost those people to give them the wisdom, then they decided to choose a king, and they chose Randor. That's how Randor became king. He was merely a captain in the guard, in the Royal Guard, or in the Guard at the time. And if you want to look at what the precedent to that is, if you read, I hate to be biblical about this, but if you read the book of Kings, Kings 1, and what's the book that just comes before that in the Bible, the one about David and all that stuff, you will find that that's exactly what happened in the Bible. What happened is the people wanted a king. They were not supposed to have a king. They had judges instead. But when the age of the judges passed, the people clamored for a king, and they were warned, you get a king, you're going to have to deal with a king. With kingship and royalty, it could be dangerous. That was the way I sort of was really structured it. This is where I come from in terms of my own teaching and writing that I do. I do a lot of teaching in terms of wisdom literature and mythology, and that was sort of the mythology that I was aiming for, but that's okay. What they did was great too.
All right, that concludes our panel. They will be signing in the main convention hall right after the panel, but let's give them one more round of applause.
Going to be an 18-year-old kid. He should look like an 18-year-old kid before he says, I have the power, and boom, he becomes Mr. Muscle. And that's exactly what they did, and I think it worked much better. Now, there are people who go back to the original series and say, oh, yeah, but you played around with that classic series. Well, the original idea in the classic series was to do just that. But because of economic restraints, they didn't do it. There were other things that I wanted to do, and that is to get the origins story into the series, which they did very cleverly. We did the first 3 episodes, or 2 episodes, the first 3. The first 3 episodes are the origin episodes, which did exactly that. It showed how Adam becomes He-Man, the development of it, the development of the characters, gives you more backstory so that you understand the characters better. And that was sort of the direction we went. They also asked me to do, later after I developed this, Mattel asked me if I would come up with some storylines, and I came up with 25 storylines for the first season, hopefully, none of which Mike used. I think they're great. I even have them here.
Awesome.
But one of the problems with it was the idea that I had, which we had discussed at Mattel within the boundaries of the Mattel thing, was to do a series which had a continuing storyline, as well as a B story that would be finished, would begin and end with each episode. The problem with that, as a series, there's a problem with doing a continuing storyline when you get into syndication, I assume. It used to be that way. Whereas it's still there. You have a problem because suppose they put in episode number 9 ahead of episode number 3, and then your continuing story sort of like falls flat. It's not as if you're doing a network show. But that was the original idea, was to do a continuing storyline. At the end, my version had at the end of season 1, He-Man actually becomes a renegade. Skeletor is sort of infiltrates into the Eternian society, convinces people that he's changed his ways, becomes what they think is a good guy, but in reality, he puts Randor out of business by almost killing him, places Marlena into a suspended animation, and takes over as dictator of Eternia, and convinces the people in Eternia that He-Man is a renegade and a bad guy. So he and the Masters of the Universe have to leave, and they have to go into this bunker, I call it the Cave of Freedom. Why not? And they fight their battle from there. It's sort of a Robin Hood story, essentially. You know, he's Robin Hood, and Skeletor is King John. That never worked. Wise?
You did mention a lot of changes that were made. Perhaps we could explain the decision process behind, say, Cringer not talking,
right.
Queen Marlena not being from Earth.
Right. Yeah. The other thing, I think you guys did that as an episode of Marlena flying through space as an astronaut. No, you never did that. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought it was part of it.
That was back in the filmation.
That was back in the old days. Okay.
Yeah.
That was back in the old days. But just to go into that opening sequence.
Agreed. And through that process, we came across Michael's Bible, and going through it, it was so much about it was really the perfect foundation to approach how to relaunch the property. So we thought that, well, what's the best thing to do? Well, let's just call Michael and let's get him in here and involve him from the beginning, because so much of what he had originally mapped out in 1982 was just as good in 2000 when we were doing this as it was back when he wrote it.
Yeah, that's right. And so we had a lot of meetings, Ian. A whole group of us at Mattel would sit around for a couple of hours, bat ideas around which way to go, kind of direction. And then they said, well, why don't you just come back with something that you think is going to work? So I went back to my original notion and I expanded on it somewhat and came up with some new ideas, but basically trying to deal with the story as it would be 20 years later, expressing some of the ideas that are going on in the world today, not as quite as naive as it was back in 1982, with a little more flair, with a little more edge to it. Plus, as I said in the previous panel, what I wanted to do was hopefully that the animators, and they did do this, by the way, Mike Young did a fabulous job, and that is to create the characters that express the way they were originally written. So whereas He-Man is He-Man, He-Man is actually the alter ego of a young kid, a teenager, an 18-year-old kid. And if he's...
The Four Horsemen based the body sculpting of He-Man on my torso.
I thought that was me.
So I guess the obvious place to start is, how exactly did the development start on the new cartoon series?
Well, okay, I guess that's me. Yeah, the 20th anniversary of He-Man was approaching. I had created the show, as most of you know, back in 1982 when the first show went on the air. I had created the original version, wrote the original Bible for the show, and worked on the show as a creative consultant for the first season that it was on. After that, it sort of went out of my hands and went into the hands of Filmation. 20 years later, I received a call from Mattel out of the blue, and they said, would you be interested in coming back? You're involved in that. Coming back, and we saw, I guess you saw the original Bible.
Yeah, we had come across Michael's Bible, and at the time, the 20th anniversary of the toy line, Mattel really wanted to bring He-Man back. And in the entertainment division, we were really getting up to speed on, I had grown up with He-Man as a kid and had been a big fan. And so it was a lot of fun to really start to, with Rob Hudnut and the marketing team and everybody involved at Mattel, really start to dive into the property and the lore and the history.
I'm John Callis from Masters Cast. I'll be your moderator. Thank you. This is the Mike Young He-Man cartoon panel. And if we could go down the line, if everyone would please introduce themselves and let us know what was your role on the cartoon.
Hi, my name is Michael Halpern. I was brought in by Mattel to develop the new television series. They brought me back after 20 years. I guess they dug up my grave and thought that I could do a job on this. And it was an opportunity to recreate the series the way I thought it should be.
I'm Gary Hartle. I'm a producer, director, and sometimes storyboard artist on the new series. My challenge was to bring all their ideas onto the screen.
My name is Ian Richter, and I was the executive at Mattel that was part of the team that was bringing the new series and the property back to life in 2002.
My name is Dean Stephan. I was the writer, I guess head writer, story editor. More importantly, I was